Natalie Kunsman, MD, and today I'm going to help you interpret your diabetic labs. So in your diabetic labs, one thing that you will note is a CBC, and that stands for a complete blood count. Now that is not necessarily indicative of anything related to the sugars, but as we will discover later on in our discussion, it is imperative for that level to be normal to actually make heads or tails over some of the other labs that you have. And this is the complete count between your red blood cells and your white blood cells, and it will fractionate out the different ages and sizes of your red blood cells, and it will actually fractionate out the different types of white blood cells you have and in what percentages. So down to the meat of the matter, which is our sugar levels. One level that we will use is a fasting glucose. And a fasting glucose typically should be around 75 to 95. And that implies literally what it's measuring. A fasting before you have eaten level of a sugar that is circulating in your bloodstream. Now there are other times we will use a 2-hour postprandial glucose. Now that will refer to 2 hours after a meal. We may want to look at that glucose because a lot of times that is the highest of your day. That is the normal spike in glucose, and to that note will be a spike in insulin. And we want to see what you look like in a non-fasting state. Then, especially for you pregnant women, you may be familiar with something called a glucose tolerance test. Now, we will use that a lot of times in pregnant women, and even in some of our integrative cancer patients. We want to know how you are metabolizing your sugar. So what we will do in a 1 hour or 2 hour or 3 hour glucose tolerance test is we will give you a sugary drink and measure that sugar 1 hour after that drink, 2 hours after that drink, or 3 hours after that drink. And sometimes we will find the hidden sugar dysregulations, and that's in next we have our insulin levels. So we want to see the health of that pancreas, and we want to see how much insulin you are secreting. So literally it is measuring that insulin. Now, if the insulin levels are in excess, we may start noticing that this is the first sign of a type 2 diabetic who's having difficulty using that insulin. And insulin is used to bring that sugar inside of a cell for its metabolic purposes. And if you are either secreting too much insulin or not processing insulin at the cellular level, you are becoming insulin resistant. So instead of that insulin being used in the cell, it keeps building and building in the bloodstream, or your pancreas is noticing that that sugar is not getting imported into the cell, and it will start secreting more and more insulin in response to all of the excess sugars that you are supplying your body of. Now, as a reminder, our cells have insulin receptors, and especially in an obese patient, since the body is seeing so much excess glucose, the body's going to make more receptors on those cells to try to pull in the extra glucose. But it gets to a point where the system is so overwhelmed that there's already enough sugar in the cell that those insulin receptors now become resistant and will not allow any more insulin in because it can't handle any more sugar coming in. And then those receptors themselves are insulin resistant. Now, there are some patients who have low insulin levels or catastrophically no insulin levels, and that is a type 1 diabetic. Now, there are ways for us to figure out whether you're a type 1 or type 2 in case the clinical presentation is a little bit hard to figure out early on. So a lot of times I will measure a C-peptide. Now, this is used sometimes instead of checking antibodies, which we'll talk about. And this measures how much C peptide is in your blood, because the level of this peptide generally matches the insulin level in the body and can help us figure out how much insulin your body is producing. So very low levels of C peptide means very low levels of production of insulin, hence leading us to a type 1 diabetic picture. Now, we will also measure anti-islet cell antibodies, because islet cells are those cells in the pancreas that will secrete the insulin. And type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune phenomenon in which the body is attacking those islet cells to the point where there's no insulin production. And of course, that patient would need insulin for survival, but an anti-islet cell antibody will help us figure this out. There are a few others, but one other I will mention is the insulin autoantibody, in which, again, and attacking those beta cells in the immune system, people with type 1 diabetes will also target that insulin, and we can look for antibodies that will attack the insulin. Now, the one test that most of you are becoming familiar with is the A1C. What exactly is this A1C? Okay, well, it actually is a glycosylated hemoglobin. So it's a hemoglobin A1C. And what that literally means is it is a percentage. So if your A1C is 5.9, that means that 5.9% of your hemoglobin or your red blood cells has a sugar coating on it. Now, as I mentioned early on, a CBC is something that is in a standard blood profile. And if your hemoglobin is low for some reason or anemic, you're not going to get an accurate representation of how much sugar, how much percentage sugar is on the hemoglobin, because your hemoglobin's lower. Therefore, the sugar that is on that hemoglobin will give you either a false high or false low representation. So we need an intact CBC to make really good sense of the glycosylation or sugar accumulation on the red blood cell. I will also make notation about the A1C being a glycosylated product of too much sugar in the body. There are other tissues in the body that glycosylate. So, of course, bony tissue can glycosylate, and some of the support structures can glycosylate. Some of the endothelial lining of our arterial wall can glycosylate. But this is the measure that we will use because we have good standardized information to help stratify the management of diabetes. I want to make notation yet of your lipid profile. Now, while this may seem to only make sense to be measuring cholesterol and your lipids, it directly and sometimes indirectly is giving us a picture of how healthy the immune system is and how healthy the sugar system is being regulated. So what we are noticing with a lipid profile is a total cholesterol, and that's kind of a given that everybody understands. But it will fractionate out what we call lipoproteins. And these are the carrier proteins that will help take these lipids through the bloodstream and take them back to the liver to digest and break down. So again, the liver needs to be healthy. Or it may take it to other parts in the body that need that cholesterol for other synthesis, such as our hormones and our brain health. Now, within that profile, we are noticing triglycerides. And triglycerides will go up when the body is perceiving a lot of excess of those sugars, and it doesn't know what to do with those sugars because they can't get in the cells anymore. So the body will package them up in packages of 3, and the liver will try to conjugate and pull them together and try to break them down when they are needed to be liberated. So we need very good liver health. But I will tell you, If you are noticing that those triglycerides are climbing, that is an indication that your sugars are completely dysregulated and the liver cannot handle the burden. This is why in diabetic management, this is not only about the pancreas function. This is about insulin receptors at the cellular level and the liver that can't keep up with the demands and may start doing a lot of what we call excessive gluconeogenesis, or making too much sugar when all these triglyceride stores are elevated in the system. Too high of triglycerides, especially over 400, can cause pancreatitis and pancreas dysfunction, which will only further the diabetic phenomenon. And back to our liver health. When we check the liver profiles in a diabetic patient, a lot of times they are elevated because, again, with the overburdened nature of excessive sugars and fuel in the system, the liver will start laying down a lot of fatty streaking in the liver, and the fat will replace good liver cells, and a diabetic patient can develop a fatty liver. Or I may say in reverse, a fatty liver patient will go on to become diabetic because of all of this dysregulation. So I hope I have painted a decent picture of how you can make heads or tails of your labs when they come in to help you assess whether or not your diabetes is under control or it is not and needs more attention. Again, I'm Natalie Kunsman, MD. Subscribe to my channel below, and until we meet again, be well.